Picture this. It is 4 in the morning on September the 12th, 1918, and the sky over northeastern France does not look like a sky anymore. It looks like the end of the world arriving early. Nearly 3,000 guns fire at once, so many that men miles behind the front line feel the earth itself flinch beneath their boots, and for 4 hours straight their horizon simply does not stop burning. Somewhere in that firestorm, 500,000 American soldiers are crouched in the mud, most of them barely out of their teens, almost none of them ever having fired a shot at another human being, waiting for the whistle that will send them walking directly into machine gun fire. This is the moment America's army stops being a rumor the world laughs about and becomes something the German High Command will never be able to ignore again. And yet, if you ask almost anyone today what happened at St. Mihiel, you will get a blank stare. Not because it wasn't bloody, not because it wasn't massive, but because history has a strange habit of burying its most important days under the noise of the ones that came right after. By the end of this video, you are going to understand why an entire American army was built, tested, and nearly torn apart by its own allies just so it could bleed in a muddy French salient most people have never heard of, and why what happened there in 4 days in September of 1918 quietly reshaped the entire rest of the war. Stay with me, because the twist in this story is not what America won. It's what almost stopped America from being allowed to fight at all, and what happened to the men who survived it once the guns finally stopped. To understand why St. Mihiel mattered, you have to go back 4 years earlier to 1914. When the German army punched a bulge into the French lines southeast of Verdun and simply never left. That bulge was called a salient, a bump in the front line shaped almost like a triangle pointing straight into French territory, and at its tip sat a small town called St. Mihiel. For the French, this triangle was a permanent humiliation. It choked off railway lines, it threatened Verdun's flank, and for 4 straight years, French soldiers threw themselves against German defenses dug so deep and so cleverly that entire divisions were swallowed whole trying to dislodge them. The trenches near St. Mihiel had names that soldiers spoke like curses. The Trench of Thirst, where men fought for 3 days without food or water before finally surrendering. The Burned Forest, where French troops were slaughtered trying to retake a single fortified position. This was not new ground. This was some of the most fought over, blood-soaked real estate on the entire Western Front, and by 1918, it had become a symbol of everything static and hopeless about trench warfare. Entire French generations had already been spent trying to erase this triangle from the map, and every single one of them had failed. Now, bring in the Americans. By the summer of 1918, the United States had been in the war for over a year, but here is the part most people don't realize. American soldiers had barely fought as an American army. They'd been split up, folded into French and British units, used as reinforcements plugged into somebody else's plan, somebody else's command structure, somebody else's war. The French and British High Command actually preferred it this way. They saw the Americans as raw, green, untested, and honestly, a little bit naive. Better to feed these fresh troops into experienced divisions than risk an amateur American command losing an entire battle through sheer inexperience. But one man refused to accept that arrangement, and his name was General John J. Pershing. Pershing was stubborn in a way that frustrated nearly everyone around him, allies included. He believed, almost to the point of obsession, that America's soldiers deserved to fight as America's army under an American flag, commanded by American officers. And if that meant clashing with the most powerful military minds in Europe, so be it. In August of 1918, Pershing finally got what he wanted. The American First Army was activated, an independent fighting force answering only to him, and its very first mission would be to erase that 4-year-old scar on the map, the St. Mihiel salient. But here's where the story almost falls apart before it even begins. Just weeks before the attack, the legendary French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the supreme commander of all Allied forces, tried to gut Pershing's plan entirely. Foch wanted to break up the offensive, scale it down, and scatter American divisions back under French control for a completely different operation. For Pershing, this wasn't just a tactical disagreement. It was an attack on the very idea he'd fought for months to establish, the idea that America could stand and fight as its own army. The meeting between the two men became so heated that Foch, exasperated, finally demanded to know, did Pershing even want to take part in the coming battle at all? Pershing's answer became one of the most quietly defiant lines of the entire war. Most assuredly, he said, but as an American army and in no other way. Foch backed down, and with that single sentence, the fate of 500,000 American lives was locked in. Now imagine the scale of what had to happen next, in only a matter of weeks. Pershing's staff, led by a young, meticulous officer named George Marshall, the same George Marshall who would later become one of the most powerful men in America during the Second World War, had to move over 500,000 American troops and more than 100,000 French soldiers into position, along with 3,000 artillery pieces, 200,000 tons of supplies, and 50,000 tons of ammunition. All of it had to travel over narrow, overcrowded French roads, mostly at night, without German reconnaissance planes spotting the buildup. Trucks move with no headlights. Entire divisions marched for miles in total darkness, guided only by whispered orders and the sound of the man in front of them. It was, by any measure, one of the most complex logistical operations attempted by the American military up to that point in history, planned and executed almost entirely by officers who had never commanded anything close to this scale before, and one single mistake, one leaked report, one spotted convoy, could have handed the Germans everything they needed to turn this surprise attack into a slaughter. And it wasn't just soldiers and guns. This battle would introduce the world to weapons and tactics that had barely been tested before. A young, ambitious tank officer named George S. Patton, yes, that Patton, had spent the past year training 2 battalions of small, fast French-built tanks, and St. Mihiel would be his first real combat command. The very beginning of a legend that would one day terrify the German army all over again in a completely different war. In the skies above, an aggressive, outspoken airman named Billy Mitchell assembled the largest air armada the world had ever seen for a single battle, nearly 1,500 aircraft, American, French, British, and Italian planes flying together under a single coordinated air command for the first time in history. Mitchell believed air power could dominate a battlefield in ways nobody had truly attempted, and St. Mihiel would become his proving ground. This one battle, in other words, was quietly stacking up a list of firsts that would echo for the rest of the 20th century. The first major American-led offensive of the war, the first large-scale use of tanks under American command, the first time the terms D-Day and H-Hour were ever used by American forces to mark the moment of attack. Nobody standing in those trenches on the 11th of September had any idea they were standing at the birth of modern combined arms warfare, the same style of fighting that would define every major war for the rest of the century. The night before the attack, the mood among the American soldiers was a strange mixture of nerves and something close to boyish excitement. Rain had turned the roads and fields into thick, sucking mud, so heavy that some men said it felt like the ground itself was trying to hold them back before the battle had even begun. Most of these men had trained in France for less than a year, some divisions for barely a few months, and many of them had never been under real artillery fire before. And yet there was a hunger in them, a desperate need to prove that America belonged in this war as more than just a reserve of manpower for tired European armies. What none of them knew, what not even Pershing's intelligence teams fully understood at first, was that on the German side of the line, something extraordinary was happening at almost the exact same moment. The German High Command had quietly decided the St. Mihiel salient was no longer worth defending. It was too exposed, too costly to hold, and with the war turning against them on other fronts, German commanders had begun issuing secret withdrawal orders. On the 8th of September, 4 days before the American attack, the order went out. German forces began pulling back, moving artillery, supplies, and rear formations out of the salient under cover of night. In other words, as 500,000 Americans prepared to storm one of the most heavily fortified positions on the Western Front, the enemy inside it was already halfway out the door, and neither side fully realized what that accident of timing was about to do to the battle. At 1 in the morning on September the 12th, the artillery barrage began, and it did not stop for 4 straight hours. Nearly 3,000 guns, many of them French, hammered German positions in a rolling storm of fire designed to shred barbed wire, collapse trenches, and shatter the nerve of anyone still inside them. Men who lived through it later said the ground itself seemed to breathe, rising and falling under the weight of every impact, and that the noise stopped feeling like sound, and started feeling like sound, and started feeling like pressure against the skull. Then, at 5 in the morning, American infantry began climbing out of their trenches and moving forward into what should have been a meat grinder of prepared German defenses. Instead, they walked into chaos. German units caught mid-withdrawal found themselves scrambling, disorganized, artillery pieces half-loaded onto transport, defensive lines manned by skeleton crews who had expected days more to finish pulling out. The German position, weakened by its own retreat and battered by the barrage, began to collapse almost immediately, and American soldiers who had spent the entire night bracing for the worst found themselves instead advancing through positions that were already crumbling before they even arrived. From the northwest, the American 5th Corps pushed forward. From the southeast, the 4th and 1st Corps drove in. And from the southern tip of the triangle, French colonial troops pushed straight toward the town of St. Mihiel itself, entering the town on the 15th of September and capturing 4,000 prisoners in the process. Pershing's plan was a classic pincer, two powerful thrusts designed to meet deep inside the salient at a village called Vignes-Louge, trapping any German forces still caught inside. And it worked with a speed that stunned even the Americans themselves. Within 36 hours, American forces had captured more than 13,000 prisoners and hundreds of German artillery pieces. By the next day, nearly every objective on Pershing's map had already been reached, a pace of advance almost nobody, including the Americans themselves, had truly expected. Soldiers who had trained for a slow, brutal, yard-by-yard grind through fortified lines instead found themselves marching past abandoned German kitchens, with food still warm on the stoves. A strange and almost eerie sign of just how sudden the German collapse really was. But do not mistake speed for safety. This was still a battlefield, and battlefields still killed people, regardless of how disorganized the enemy was. American soldiers pushing through pockets of resistance ran directly into German machine gun nests that had not received the retreat order in time, or simply chose to fight rather than surrender. And those isolated pockets could turn a quiet advance into a bloodbath within seconds. Patton's tanks, mechanically fragile and painfully slow, broke down constantly in the churned, cratered ground, forcing crews to abandon them under fire or push forward on foot instead. And at one point, Patton himself was seen walking ahead of his own stalled tanks, waving his men forward through open ground, while enemy fire cracked past him. Overhead, Mitchell's aircraft dueled with German planes, desperately trying to protect their retreating columns, and pilots on both sides fell out of the sky in numbers that never made the front pages back home. By the time the guns finally fell silent, American forces had suffered around 7,000 casualties in just a few days of fighting, a number that sounds almost small compared to the meat grinder battles of Verdun or the Somme earlier in the war, but represented thousands of individual young men, many barely out of high school age, who would never see their families again. German losses were far heavier still, more than 20,000 casualties, with over 10,000 of their own men marched off as prisoners of war, entire columns of exhausted, mud-covered soldiers trudging past their captors in silence. Here's the part where I want you to lean in a little closer, because this is where the story stops being a simple victory and becomes something far more complicated. On paper, St. Mihiel was a clean, decisive American success. The salient that had haunted the French for 4 straight years was erased in a matter of days. But here's the uncomfortable truth nobody puts on the recruitment posters. Much of that success came not from American brilliance, but from lucky timing. The Germans were already retreating before the attack even started. Historians have debated for over a century how differently this battle might have gone had the Americans struck just a week earlier into a salient still fully manned, fully entrenched, fully prepared to make every single yard of advance cost blood. Pershing's army proved it could plan, mobilize, and execute a massive independent offensive. What it did not yet prove, and what would be tested with brutal, merciless clarity just 2 weeks later, was whether American troops could grind through an enemy that was not already halfway out the door. Because almost immediately after St. Mihiel ended, Pershing did something almost unthinkable in modern military terms. He ordered the exact same soldiers who had just fought through 4 days of continuous combat to pack up, march, and redeploy 60 miles north into a completely different sector of the front to begin an entirely new offensive within roughly 2 weeks. This wasn't rest. This wasn't recovery. Men who had barely slept in days were handed fresh ammunition and pointed toward a new front line before the mud of St. Mihiel had even dried on their boots. Exhausted men who had just watched friends die in that mud were now being funneled directly into what would become the deadliest battle in American military history, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, a grinding 47-day nightmare that would ultimately cost over 26,000 American lives. And this, right here, is the real reason St. Mihiel gets forgotten. It wasn't erased by failure. It was overshadowed by something even bloodier that came immediately after it. Something so catastrophic in scale that it swallowed St. Mihiel's legacy whole. St. Mihiel became the warm-up act nobody remembers, standing in the shadow of the headline battle that followed it by mere days, a battle so brutal that it made a 4-day fight with 7,000 casualties look, in the eyes of history, almost like a footnote. And yet, if you zoom out far enough, St. Mihiel's true importance has almost nothing to do with the casualty numbers at all. What actually happened in those 4 days quietly rewired how the rest of the war, and honestly, the rest of the century, would unfold. For the first time, British and French military leadership watched an entirely American-planned, American-led offensive succeed on its own terms, without European officers holding the reins. That single fact mattered enormously, because it changed how seriously the Allies took American military independence going forward, and it directly shaped how much influence the United States would demand at the negotiating table when Germany finally collapsed just 2 months later. The battle also validated, almost overnight, ideas that had only existed in theory before. Billy Mitchell's massive coordinated air armada demonstrated that air power could be organized on a scale nobody had previously attempted, directly influencing military aviation doctrine for decades afterward. Doctrine that would eventually shape the strategic bombing campaigns of the Second World War. Patton's tank battalions, clumsy and mechanically unreliable as they were, planted the earliest seeds of the armored warfare doctrine he would later perfect and unleash across Europe in 1944. The very officer who quietly organized the logistics behind St. Mihiel's success, George Marshall, would go on to become the architect of America's entire military strategy in World War II, and later the man behind the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe from the ashes. In other words, nearly every major American military figure of the next global conflict cut their teeth, in one way or another, inside this one obscure, muddy French salient that most people alive today have never once heard mentioned. So why does nobody talk about St. Mihiel? Partly timing, as we said, buried under the shadow of Meuse-Argonne. Partly scale, since compared to the staggering, almost incomprehensible casualty figures of Verdun or the Somme, 7,000 American casualties can look deceptively small on a page, even though it represented one of the costliest few days in American military history up to that point. But mostly, it comes down to how history chooses its main characters. We remember the battles that ended wars, or the ones that produced the highest body counts, or the ones with the most dramatic last stands. We tend to forget the battles that simply proved something was possible, the quiet turning points where a nation stopped being untested and started being taken seriously. St. Mihiel wasn't the bloodiest day of the war. It wasn't even the bloodiest day of the war. It wasn't even the bloodiest day for American forces in 1918, but it was the day the rest of the world was forced to stop treating the American army as an experiment and start treating it as a force that could plan, execute, and win its own battles on its own terms. 4 days in a muddy salient in northeastern France, 4 days most people alive today couldn't place on a map, quietly decided how seriously America would be treated at the peace table, how air power would be organized in the next global war, and who would be standing at the head of American military strategy just 20 years later. And somewhere in all of that, 7,000 young men paid for it with their bodies, in a battle so quickly forgotten that most of their own descendants have never once heard its name spoken aloud. Sometimes the most important days in history aren't the ones soaked in the most blood. They're the quiet ones that decide who gets to write the next chapter. And St. Mihiel, forgotten as it is, wrote a chapter that shaped the entire rest of the 20th century.